Congratulations on being on the Fiction Uncovered 2013 list. All the Beggars Riding is a wonderful book. It's actually a compulsive story, and it's heartbreaking and moving and emotional, and it's also about the nature of storytelling itself, I think. Tell us a bit about All the Beggars Riding.
All the Beggars Riding is the story of Lara Moorhouse. It starts off as Lara's memoir. She's approaching 40 when she writes her memoir, and her mother has just died, and she realises she's lost the chance to ask her parents all the questions that she wishes she'd asked them, because when Lara was growing up she had an unusual childhood. Her father came over to visit them in London once or twice a month because he worked in Belfast. This is during the Troubles, so he was a plastic surgeon working on victims of the Troubles. He comes over twice a month to visit them because he has another wife, an actual wife, and another family in Belfast. And Lara discovers this when she's 12 and her world is blown apart. Her father dies shortly afterwards. So she sets out to write her memoirs of the father she never knew and the mother who wouldn't leave him and the devastation they left behind. So the first half of the book is her attempt to write her memoirs. But it breaks down because she realises that even when she has the facts, she doesn't have the understanding. She just can't understand why her mother would have a relationship with a man who was married, why she would stay with him, why she would have children with him. And so Lara is then persuaded to write her parents' story as fiction, as a way of trying to understand them, which she subsequently does. So the second half of the novel is Lara's parents' story as she imagines it.
A lot of novels are about high-achieving people, people who have sort of glamorous lives or wealthy lives or very interesting jobs. But in many ways, Lara, in conventional terms, is a bit of a failure. She's working part-time as a carer, she's had a broken relationship, and I really loved the fact that you got into someone who has not been hugely successful, but still has a kind of an intellectual life and an imagination and a real sort of curiosity about her past. Was that a conscious decision?
Yes, I think my sister is a palliative care doctor. And so she worked for a while as an agency carer, as a part-time agency carer. And I just found her story so fascinating. And every time I'm having a hard day writing or I'm feeling sorry for myself or exhausted, I remind myself of the work that my sister is doing. You know, she works with people, sometimes children, who are at the very, very end of their lives and with their families. And so I thought it was very important that Lara was someone who does a real job and who is caring for people. And I realised, you know, I talk to my sister and I hear her stories of her day, and I realised that I haven't read very much of that in fiction. It was also important that Lara is not a writer at the start of the novel. I think she becomes a writer as she's telling her story and she discovers the power of narrative and the power of fiction. But at the beginning of the novel, she's tentative and hesitant, and she writes. I was trying to capture a realistic way of writing memory, because I think too often I've read books where memories come perfectly formed and lyrical and coherent, and memory isn't like that. You know, memory will blindside you. Something that you thought hadn't known that you'd forgotten will sometimes strike you, or you'll argue with a friend or family member about the nature of memory. And so I wanted some of that, what it actually feels like to remember and how hard it is to tell a story, to be part of the story as well.
One of the other things I loved about All the Beggars Riding is the way in which you go into quite a lot of detail about the practicalities of this extraordinary situation. Here's a young woman, Jane, a nurse, who's fallen madly in love with the doctor in the Harley Street practice, and he's married, he has a family, and then they set up this whole alternative family. He comes over once a fortnight. But there are things like Lara, as a 12-year-old, is really upset she's still having to share a bedroom with her little brother, who's really annoying, and all her friends at school have their own bedrooms. And what she realises later, it's all to do with the economic practicality.
I was absolutely fascinated by the grand passion and the love affair. I mean, who wouldn't be? But I think I was even more fascinated by the sheer banality of leading a double life. When you get into the practicality of it, you know, how does it work? I think we can all imagine falling for someone that we shouldn't, or having a passionate affair that is of a short duration. But when it comes to having a whole other household for a decade and a half, you know, once you start imagining your way into it, it's fascinating. You know, you think, how does Christmas work? And how does bill payment work? And how do birthdays work? And when your children start getting old enough to ask questions about why daddy is never there at Christmas, even when they know that the clinic is closed over Christmas, all those little things I was fascinated by. So I wanted to really get inside the day-to-day minutiae and the sheer amount of lies and half-lies and lies of omission that are needed to feed the need of the greater deception.
Your main male character is this, you know, this very sort of romantic figure, this plastic surgeon. He initially seems very heroic figure. You know, he's mending damaged people. He's mending their faces, sometimes other parts of their bodies. He's sort of big, hulking, sort of handsome, bearded man. But as the book progresses, we start to see that in many ways he's a very weak man and a very confused man as well.
I think the key moment where my book came together was watching a brilliant documentary by Nathaniel Kahn called My Architect. He's the son of Louis Kahn, the architect, and he grew up as the only child of Louis's third family. He grew up seeing his father once a fortnight. His father had a wife and a second household with children, and Louis and his mother were the third household. So it's extraordinary, and Nathaniel Kahn, long after his father is dead, sets out to make this film to try to understand his father. So he visits the iconic buildings that his father made, and he visits the other women that loved his father. And the brilliant thing, and the thing that really chimed with me, is that it isn't done out of a spirit of recrimination or bitterness. He's really seeking to understand who must this man have been, and how charismatic he must have been, and why all these women devoted their lives to him. And so my plastic surgeon had to be charismatic. He had to be, from the outside, someone who's a woman, or more than one woman would fall in love with. He had to have that charm and that roguishness and that charisma. But the more I wrote his character, and the more Lara wrote her father's character, the more I think both of us understood that he's fundamentally weak. He has a double life for so long that the fact of both lives becomes essential to him, and he's unable to do what he should have done, and he's unable to let Jane go.
Although at the heart of the novel there's a love story, and then there's a daughter going in search of her parents' love story, it's also very much about the nature of narrative, about the nature of storytelling. And the longer the novel goes on, the more Lara herself realises how sort of fractured and open to interpretation stories are.
I think the nature of storytelling was something I was thinking about a lot in the couple of years before I started All the Beggars Riding. My second novel had taken 6 years on and off to write, and it was very traditional. It was third person, past tense novel. I think I'm a playwright as well, so I'm much more comfortable doing first person, ventriloquizing, just becoming my characters and losing any sense of myself. So writing this third person, past tense, sort of more traditional narrative, I felt stifled, and I felt that the book felt airless to me, and so I wanted to go back to that idea of a first person and a character really telling their story. At the same time, I just started teaching writing myself, and so I'd spent a lot of time thinking about how do you teach writing well, and how do you interrogate narrative, and how do you avoid falling into the things it's too easy to say, like show don't tell, or don't have too many characters, or make sure the end of each chapter has a hook, or all of the sort of superficial things that I think are quite often taught but bear absolutely no relation to what it actually means to write a novel and to understand how narrative works. So I think I've spent a lot of time thinking about that, and with Beggars I was really keen to strip back the story so as to make the telling of the story part of the story itself.
You've also got a whole host of minor characters that I thought you created incredibly well. There's her brother, who's so sweet, heartbreakingly sweet as a boy, and as a grown man has become this kind of bulky estate agent with a rather horrible wife, Danielle. So somehow you managed the passage of time and the changes that people go through incredibly well. How did you do all that on a practical level? Did you have a chart with, dates and what age everybody would be at different stages, that sort of thing?
Yeah, because the novel starts off as a memoir and a fake memoir, I had to do so much scaffolding, to make sure that all of the references were absolutely spot on. I had to have charts of exactly what was happening in Belfast. I even researched the weather. When Lara and her mother make their first trip to Belfast when she's a child, I was able to find out, and this is where Google, the internet is brilliant, I was able to find out what the weather would have been that week at the end of August in Belfast. As well, I had to do the research. At one point, Jane is walking along Regent Street and it's Christmas time, and I wanted to feel a real disconnect between all the lights in the shops and her feeling she's just discovered she's pregnant with her lover's child and he isn't answering her phone calls. Then I was, in the research that I was doing to just make sure all my details were accurate, I discovered that was the year of the miners' strikes and there were no Christmas lights on Oxford Street or Regent Street during that year. And that's a sort of detail that, because you're writing a memoir, could make the whole edifice, crumble, make the whole thing unravel. Luckily I discovered in time, so I was able to flip it, and so she's walking along Regent Street feeling sad and lonely and disconnected, and there aren't even any Christmas lights. So you're able to use the facts that you research to evoke the emotional landscape you're trying to use. But there was a lot of research that I had to do, particularly to make the memoir aspect ring true.
It's been fantastically successful. Quite widely successful as well. You're the Belfast One City One Read choice this year. What are you working on now? What's next?
Writing all the Beggars Riding was just the most exhausting experience. I think the story demanded to be written with such intensity. The actual writing of it took less than a year. Of course there's a great deal of editing and polishing and rewriting after that, but the main body of the book was written very intensively, and I finished it. I've never felt so exhausted after finishing something. I've got used to the feeling of, you finish a novel or a play and you think you'll never write anything again, and then bit by bit your well replenishes itself, or your battery, whatever image you want to use. But with this one I felt a sort of exhaustion that I haven't felt since, and so I think it'll be a while before I start work on another novel. I'm working on a new play, which is brilliant and terrifying in a different way, because it uses completely different muscles. It's a completely different narrative and demands different things of you. So that's occupying me for the moment.